Okay, today is July 17th, 2020. I'm Kevin Ryan. I'm here with Tom Ryan and his memories, and along with Barbara, his wife. And today we're going to talk about politics again. This is the third day in a row we're going to talk about politics. And so uh, today we'd like to talk about just kind of general national politics and your involvement with politics over that time.
Hmm. Yeah, previous tapes I've mentioned politics, but uh, how did I get to be a Democrat? I think I want to explain that. Most people that today that vote Democratic have graduated from college, and most people who didn't graduate from college vote Republican, and that's a real split in the two parties. So I went to college, and so that explains why I'm a Democrat. Well, it's more complicated than that. My grandparents came to this country from Holland, and they were Democrats, dairy farmers. My grandfather joined the co-op and shipped his milk into Waukegan, Illinois, uh, at first with a wagon drawn by horses, and then put it on the railroad train. And by belonging to a co-op, most people were looking for a better way they didn't like the merchants, the businessmen, the bankers. They were kind of the villains into the working class. And so that was another example. It was the time of William Jennings Bryan was campaigning for president. He campaigned 4 times and lost every time, but he was a very populist, and he was much left, and a lot of he was a Democrat. He took over the Democratic Party with his Farmers Alliance Party, and I think I remember that when I took my first college history course, the teacher was a fan of William Jennings Bryan, and I became one and was excited by him. But of course, he never won. And the popular party.
He was a populist, right? He was a populist.
What is a populist?
Well, a populist is different. I mean, they call the current president a populist, but they appeal to the lowest levels of society, the ordinary working man, the everyday working man, not to the business class, and not to the rich people. So that would be a populist. They get their power from the people, and not from money and donations from rich people.
Now,
so that's, I guess, what a populist does.
Your relative, you said the De Vrieses came over from Holland, and they were farmers, and they in a co-op, and that sounds socialist.
Yeah, well, I don't think they would ever thought they were socialists, and of course they were Catholic, and most Catholics were Democrats, and my parents and all my uncles, they voted Democratic. They didn't talk about politics a lot. It wasn't a favorite subject like it is with me, and but they always voted Democratic, and Catholics at that time were mostly working class. They weren't owners. They weren't the bosses. They were the employees, and they were mostly immigrants. And so they voted Democratic, and they formed labor unions, and most labor unions were made up of Catholic workers. So that partly I inherited that from my family.
But your father he worked for the government, right? So he was a public employee.
He belonged to the Postal Workers Union.
Okay.
And so I think union people were mostly Democrats, the workers in the factories. My father didn't talk about politics a lot. My parents didn't, but he voted. They always voted. It was very important that they got to vote because you had to be a citizen to vote. And my grandparents were always voted also. My father voted Democratic, I know, but when Eisenhower came along, of course, he had a lot of company. He voted Republican, I think, for the first time in his life. And he thought he made up his mind always and was made a choice. He didn't just blindly vote for the Democrat. And
The Democrat at that time was Adlai Stevenson, wasn't it?
yeah,
From
Adlai
Illinois.
Stevenson was very intellectual. They called him an egghead. And Adlai Stevenson said, "Eggheads of the world arise." We are, but there weren't enough eggheads to elect Adlai Stevenson, and Eisenhower won 2 terms, and that kind of broke the New Deal. The New Deal helped poor people a lot, and that, of course, attracted the votes of my family.
What did you think of Eisenhower?
Eisenhower was very middle of the road. He did a lot of good things. He brought the country together. He was not a divider. He was a includer, and he didn't follow the Republican line all the time. One of the biggest public work projects he did was the interstate highway system. He inaugurated that, and that was that could be called a socialistic. We had socialistic highways in a big way in his administration. But he didn't really, the label, in fact, when he was thinking of running and didn't know whether he'd never voted before, Eisenhower had been a soldier, and he stayed out of politics. So they didn't know what he was. And there were Democrats who went to him and asked him to run as a Democrat. So he finally made up his mind and ran as a Republican, but he wasn't a strong Republican. So yeah, he was a good guy. I didn't vote for him. I never voted for a Republican president.
Yeah.
And so, but my father did. He thought he was open-minded and broad-minded enough to do that. So he wasn't a doctrinaire Democrat by any means. But it was when I went to college that I really, got excited about William Jennings Bryan, the populist presidential candidate who never won. And
you said that eventually he fell out of favor with you. Why is that?
Oh, William Jennings Bryan. Well, one thing, he was a bigot, and which was not unusual in his day, but he didn't include blacks in the Democratic Party. He wasn't interested in fostering it. Maybe if he had, maybe he would have gotten elected. And he was a fundamentalist in religion. He believed in evolution. Yeah, those were some of the things I learned about in college, like that evolution was not 6 days in the Bible, and the world was created in 6 days and all that sort of thing. Taking the Bible literally, I believed in science, and I found most thinking people, that was the thing we'd always say, thinking people are Democrats, and we didn't think the Republicans. They just were, they didn't think about it. They just were born Republicans, and they always voted that way. Anyway, I think that was the biggest influence on why I became a Democrat and have stayed so all my life. And even today, my fellow college graduates are voting. Now, when we go on Zoom together in the family, I'm amazed that almost all my family, my children and grandchildren, are all Democrats, except one grandpair, and they went into business for themselves, very smart, and yet didn't go to college. You're hard workers, and they became Trump fans, and they still are. And so they're the only ones in the family. So we don't talk a lot about politics when they're around, because it's difficult for them. And
was there anybody previously, a long time ago, that you couldn't talk politics with in the family?
No, really wasn't. They were open-minded about it, and the country wasn't split the way it is now. And you could be friends with people who are from other parties, and you might disagree on that, but it wasn't blood sport the way it is now. Most Democrats were from cities. Most immigrants were Democrats. Most Catholics were Democrats. And so I got a lot of it from that, I'm sure.
But there was a prejudice against Kennedy, who was a Democrat and a Catholic. And my father, I think he voted for Nixon because he did not want to vote for a Catholic. And I was appalled to think that he would do that. But I think his prejudice against the Catholics, or his fear maybe that, the Pope would start running the country.
That's right. I think, well, he was a Protestant preacher, minister. So that made a lot of difference. And we were Catholics, so we didn't have that objection. And I would guess that most of my relatives voted for Kennedy, some of them probably because he was a Catholic. But he was able to run that line. He wasn't a very good Catholic. It's about, the current president claims to be a Presbyterian, and we're Presbyterians, but we don't
Really?
claim him. And I think that's true of Kennedy. Wasn't a very good Catholic, but he came out of a very Catholic family. His mother was a praying Catholic. So I don't know that religion, I was glad that religion wasn't an issue so very much in that campaign. Back when Al Smith ran, 1928, he was Catholic from New York, but I think he was defeated because he had a New York accent. He came up the hard way, and people didn't identify with him, even though not just because he was Catholic, but that was part of it. And he was the first one to run as a Catholic and was roundly defeated, and so by Herbert Hoover.
Now,
And so
today, these times right now, the 2020s, they liken back to 1968 and that kind of thing. At the time, Lyndon Johnson was in power, of 64 anyway. From there, what do you think about that time period and compared to today, the politics?
Oh yes, it was the candidates would win by overwhelming votes. Now it's just nip and tuck, and it's only a few votes difference between the candidates. But they used to win by, like Eisenhower would win by an overwhelming majority. And Herbert Hoover, when he first ran, he took every state and had almost all the electoral votes. And that was true of most of our presidents. It was it didn't matter which party they belonged to. And Roosevelt, of course, won 4 terms as president by big votes. And I think we weren't so divided. I mean, the country could kind of settle on a candidate, and even the loser would be generous, and the losing party say, well, better luck next time. We'll come out next time. So I think that division that we have now, it's so angry. It was not true through most of my lifetime anyway. It was pretty nice, and they'd run again. They'd be polite to one another and debate. And there were some people who thought the country, of course, was going to hell with FDR as president, and he betrayed his social station because he was an aristocrat, rich aristocrat, and he was a champion of the little people. And so there was some, and there was a lot of religion and race and mixed in with politics.
You read 4 books about Lyndon Johnson.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson?
He was a very unusual person and president. And it's a series of volumes. And the author hasn't finished the last volume when Lyndon Johnson was losing the Vietnam War and finally resigned. That he hasn't written that book yet, but he wrote all the 4-volume early book. His name is Robert Caro, and the book is LBJ. And Lyndon Johnson was poor, and he grew up poor, and he always hated the college crowd in Washington, and the people, and he did go to college, but it was they said the college he went to had 1 PhD in the college, and it was not a very classy college, but it was the nearest one to his home, and he could afford to work his way through there. But he was brilliant, and he knew politics better than probably anybody ever came to Washington. He could figure out what to do to get elected, and he would do that. And he had the ability, he could, if he was talking to a fellow senator or congressman who was liberal, they'd go away thinking Lyndon Johnson was a really liberal, just like they were. And then he'd go over and talk to another one who was conservative, and they would swear that Lyndon Johnson was a very conservative president. He could just turn it on and turn it off, and people were so convinced that they were for him. That's why Caro calls him probably the best salesman in history, but as long as it's one-on-one, because if he got with a Democrat and a Republican, he would be
in trouble.
A hard time. But he took people one by one, and he grabbed their lapels, and he'd pull them toward him, and he would talk to them right in their face. And he was well liked. He had a lot of crude personality quirks, but people liked him. He always, everybody thought he was on their side. And in a way he was, as long as they gave him their vote, he didn't care. And he, when he got into power, he was a conservative, supposedly, and they would put him on the ballot with Kennedy because he would balance the ballot, not only being from the South, from the Confederacy. We had never elected a president from the Confederacy, former Confederate states, since the Civil War. And he didn't think he'd ever get elected. Well, he got in because Kennedy was assassinated, and he became president by accident. And when he got in, he started looking at the situation and what the people wanted, and he was used to delivering what people wanted. And he ran against Goldwater after he became president by the death of Kennedy. And Goldwater, he defeated Goldwater. I think he carried every state but one.
Right.
It's just a huge landslide, which was not unheard of in the presidential elections. Because Hoover, for example, his first election was by a landslide. He took every state but two. And then the next one, of course, was the Depression had hit, and he lost every state to FDR. So we have a history of back and forth, and that's kind of good. It isn't a one-party country, but when we do, we agree on who we voted for, and then they can put in policies and pass laws that are consistent with their campaign. But now with these narrow margins that recent candidates have had, and one of them was so close, they had to take it to the Supreme Court. And Bush W. Got elected over Al Gore by a vote of the Supreme Court. It was so close. And so that's been a big change. I think the splitting of a country into two distinct parts, and so loyal to their party.
Okay, well, good. Thank you. We're running long here, and I think the rest of this we can continue on with people like Bill Clinton and all the way up
Oh,
until the present, maybe in another episode. Yeah, but this has
okay.
been enlightening. Yes.
Yes,
National
yes.
politics up through Johnson. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for doing this.